Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark. Today we're going on an exciting adventure as we dive into the epic race to the South Pole. Through this story, you'll not only experience an incredible journey, but also improve your English, listening and speaking skills. Let's get started and spark up your English learning journey. Chapter 1. Two Rival Expeditions. It was the summer of 1909, a season filled with promise, adventure, and rivalry. On the morning of July 1st, two ships, each bound for an unprecedented journey, left their respective harbors. They would embark on what would become one of the greatest races in human history. The first ship, the Vellora, was a sleek black vessel that glided through the waters of the River Thames in London. On board was Captain Edmund Harris, a man with a quiet determination, the weight of his mission heavy on his shoulders. At 44 years old, Harris was neither tall nor imposing in stature, but his presence commanded respect. His calm demeanor and thoughtful eyes betrayed a mind focused on one thing: reaching the South Pole before anyone else. As the Vellora sailed away from London, the crowds gathered on the riverbanks, waving, cheering, and watching the spectacle. The excitement in the air was palpable, but amidst the cheers, Harris remained still, almost detached. The journey ahead was not just a voyage across the sea, it was a race against time and against another man who had the same goal. He knew that only one of them could claim the South Pole as their own. Harris was not alone on his ship. He had his trusted crew, including Sam Weston, a 35-year-old man with an infectious smile and a sense of humor that was much appreciated by the captain. Weston looked out at the crowd, his eyes wide with excitement. "What a day, Captain," Weston said, turning to Harris with a grin. "Look at all these people. We're going to be famous." Harris gave a small smile, though his mind was elsewhere. "Famous," he repeated, almost in a whisper. "We're going to be more than famous, Sam. We're going to be the first to reach the South Pole, and when we do, it'll be for the British Empire." Weston's eyes widened. "Do you really think we can do it, Captain?" Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the large British flag flying at the back of the ship, fluttering in the wind. "This flag," he said, pointing to it with pride, "is going with us. It'll be the first thing planted on the South Pole. And when that happens, we'll be remembered forever." Meanwhile, thousands of miles away on the northern edge of Europe, in a small village in Norway, another ship was preparing to set sail. The Kvitnes, a sturdy, ice-capable vessel, was also headed toward the Antarctic, though under very different circumstances. While Harris was preparing to take his ship south with the hope of being the first to plant a flag on the South Pole, Captain Thorvaldur Jansen had a different plan altogether. Jansen, a 45-year-old Norwegian, was known for his meticulous planning and his ability to keep his intentions hidden. While his crew believed they were headed toward the Arctic, Jansen knew something they didn't. His goal was to reach the South Pole before Harris. To make this happen, he had kept his plans secret, and only a select few knew the true mission. The Kvitnes would leave Norway, head toward Greenland to acquire sled dogs, and then journey south toward the South Pole, where they would beat Harris to the prize. As Jansen stood on the deck of the Kvitnes, watching the crew make their final preparations, he allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. This would not be an easy journey. The men on board the Kvitnes were well prepared for the Arctic conditions, but they had no idea what awaited them in Antarctica. Still, Jansen's resolve was unshaken. The race was on, and he intended to win. On the evening of July 6th, Jansen made his final preparations, looking toward the sea with an expression of quiet determination. The Kvitnes would sail under the cover of darkness, leaving behind the shores of Norway without fanfare. His crew, unaware of their true destination, climbed aboard and set sail. The cold winds of the northern seas soon enveloped the ship as it made its way toward the icy waters of the south. In the coming weeks, the two ships, the Vlora and the Kvitnes, would sail toward the same goal, each captain unaware of the other's exact plans, but both determined to be the first to claim the South Pole. Harris, aboard the Vlora, focused on his journey south, while Jansen, aboard the Kvitnes, worked quietly, silently, toward a goal that would shake the world. But for now, both captains and their crews sailed in the same direction, unaware of the deadly rivalry that was about to unfold. The race for the South Pole had begun, and only one would emerge victorious. Would it be the British team, led by the unflappable Edmund Harris? Or would the quiet, secretive Norwegian Thorvaldur Jansen win the ultimate prize? The answer would come, but not without great cost. The stage was set. The ships sailed onward toward an uncertain future. And as the sun set behind them, the wind carrying the promise of new adventures, the two crews, one British, one Norwegian, prepared for what would be the journey of a lifetime. Chapter 2: The First Steps South. The Vlora had been at sea for several weeks now, cutting through the cold, open water on its way to the icy continent of Antarctica. Captain Edmund Harris stood on the bridge, his eyes scanning the horizon as he thought about what lay ahead. The excitement and the weight of their mission had not dulled, but with each passing day, the cold and isolation of the journey began to take a toll on the crew. They were entering unfamiliar waters, and the further they sailed, the more daunting the journey became. The men of the Vlora had trained for this, but there was a world of difference between preparing on dry land and the relentless challenges of the Antarctic. As the ship sailed onward, Sam Weston, his ever-enthusiastic second-in-command, joined him on the deck. Weston, 35, was a man who found joy in even the smallest of moments, and his spirits were the kind of energy the crew relied on. As he walked up to Harris, he could hardly contain his excitement. "Look at this, Captain," Weston said, his breath visible in the cold air. "We're actually doing it. We're heading south, into the unknown. I can feel it. We're on the verge of history. Harris looked out at the sea, nodding slowly. Yes, Sam, but it's not just the unknown we're heading toward. It's a race. The South Pole is no place for mistakes. Our mission is bigger than all of us. Weston grinned. I know, Captain, but I can't help but feel the thrill of it. The crowds cheering us on as we leave London, the flag waving proudly. It's like we're invincible. Harris said nothing for a moment, his thoughts elsewhere. We'll have to be careful. There's another ship out there. We're not the only ones with the South Pole in mind. We'll need to be faster, stronger, and smarter if we're going to reach it first. Weston's smile faded slightly as he realized the gravity of what Harris was saying. You mean the Norwegians? Jansen's crew? Harris nodded. Yes, Sam, Jansen and his men. I know they'll be going for the same goal, but we can't afford to underestimate them. Not for one moment. With the mention of their rivals, Weston's excitement waned, and he turned to look out over the ocean. The Vellora had just passed the southern tip of South America and was now navigating the freezing waters of the Southern Ocean. The weather grew harsher by the day, with snow flurries becoming more frequent. The temperature dropped as the ship approached the Antarctic region. The cold wind stung their faces, and the sea was now a dark, desolate expanse, a stark reminder of the unforgiving land they were about to face. The Vellora was now entering a region where icebergs floated silently in the water. The ship had to navigate carefully, its hull scraping against frozen waters. Despite their preparations, the crew couldn't shake the tension that had begun to settle in their bones. This was no longer a simple journey. It was the beginning of an extraordinary, dangerous challenge. As the ship moved closer to its destination, the men knew they had no choice but to continue forward, no matter what obstacles they faced. Meanwhile, aboard the Kvitens, things were very different. The Kvitnes was a smaller, sturdier ship, designed to handle the toughest of conditions. It had already left the shores of Norway and was now navigating the icy waters of the North Atlantic, heading toward Greenland. Captain Thorvaldur Jansen stood at the helm, his mind sharp and focused, his eyes scanning the endless stretch of ocean. Behind him, the crew worked diligently, unaware of the true nature of their mission. Jansen's mind was always working ahead, calculating every step, considering every possible outcome. He had spent years preparing for this moment, keeping his plans secret from his men, who believed they were heading toward the Arctic. But Jansen knew the truth. They were going to the South Pole. He had no intention of letting Harris's team reach the pole first. They would be the ones to plant the Norwegian flag on the southernmost point of the earth. The Kvitnes made its way to Greenland, where Jansen had arranged to acquire sled dogs for the expedition. The crew was beginning to ask questions about their destination. Why were they stopping in Greenland? Why were they loading the ship with dogs? Jansen reassured them that it was part of their preparations for the journey north. The Arctic was a harsh environment, he explained, and they needed the dogs for sledging. It was a reasonable explanation, and for now, the men accepted it. But in the back of Jansen's mind, he was already thinking about the future, about the race ahead. He had no intention of letting Harris's team get a head start. As soon as the Kvitnes was ready, they would set sail south. And though his crew was unaware of it, Jansen's true goal had always been to reach the South Pole before anyone else. He had a plan, and he intended to execute it flawlessly. Back aboard the Valora, Harris was also deep in thought. His crew was busy preparing the ship for the harsh conditions they would soon face in Antarctica. They were checking the sledges, ensuring that everything was in place for the journey ahead. But as the ship moved further south, the men could feel the weight of their mission pressing on them. This was no longer just about reaching the pole, it was about survival. The conditions they would face in Antarctica were unknown, and there was no guarantee that they would make it back. But despite these uncertainties, Harris remained calm, focused on the goal ahead. "We're getting closer," Harris said, breaking the silence. "We've passed the point of no return. There's no turning back now." Weston nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He understood the stakes now. This was more than just an adventure. It was a battle of wills. And the outcome would determine not only the future of their expedition, but also their place in history. As the Valora drew closer to Antarctica, the tension on board began to rise. The men knew they were entering hostile territory. The cold would be unrelenting, the landscape a barren wasteland of ice and snow. There would be no room for error, no second chances. Every step they took would be one closer to their goal, but also one closer to the dangers that awaited them. In the days that followed, the Valora finally reached the frozen waters of Antarctica, where they dropped anchor and prepared to disembark. The men stood at the edge of the ship, looking out at the desolate white expanse that stretched out before them. It was a scene of stark beauty, but also of terrifying emptiness. The land beyond was inhospitable, and the ice beneath them was as dangerous as it was vast. As Harris surveyed the icy terrain, he turned to Weston. "This is it, Sam. The beginning of the end. Our journey south begins now." Weston nodded, his face serious for the first time since they had set sail. "We'll make it, Captain. We'll get there first. We have to." The first steps had been taken, and the race had officially begun. From this point on, every decision, every movement, every step would determine whether they would be the ones to plant the British flag on the South Pole, or whether their rivals would beat them to it. With the ship anchored and preparations underway, Harris knew that this was only the beginning. The real challenges lay ahead, but for now, they had made it this far, and that in itself was a victory. Chapter 3: The Secret Journey. The Valora had anchored in the cold waters of Antarctica, the vast white land stretching endlessly in all directions. Captain Edmund Harris stood on the deck, gazing at the barren landscape. The air was thick with the cold, but it was not just the physical chill that made his breath visible in the air. It was the pressure of knowing that the true race had begun. He was the first to reach Antarctica, but the real challenge lay ahead, the arduous journey to the South Pole. There was no turning back now. As Harris prepared his crew for the difficult journey that lay ahead, they were busy unloading the sledges and ponies. Sam Weston stood by Harris's side, constantly checking equipment, ensuring that everything was in place. Despite the excitement and anticipation, the weight of the expedition's demands hung heavy on them all. The ponies were restless, and the sledges, though well-made, looked fragile against the harsh conditions. "Are we ready, Captain?" Weston asked, standing by with a clipboard in hand, his eyes darting between the men as they loaded the equipment. "We're as ready as we'll ever be," Harris replied, his voice steady but laced with concern. He turned to Weston. "But remember, Sam, this is just the beginning. We're not just walking to the pole. We're heading into a desolate land. The cold will be our enemy. We must be prepared for everything." Weston nodded, his optimism slightly subdued by the seriousness in Harris's tone. "I know, Captain. But we've trained for this. We've planned. And we have the best equipment money can buy." Harris didn't answer right away. His thoughts were still on the ship that might be ahead of them. Jansen's ship, the Kvitnes, had left a week after them, and while they had not yet encountered it, Harris couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the Norwegian crew was not just heading toward the Arctic as they had claimed. Harris had no direct evidence, but he suspected that Jansen's true goal was to claim the South Pole before the British. They were racing against time, and Harris knew that one mistake could cost them the prize. Meanwhile, aboard the Kvitnes, Thorvaldur Jansen stood with a map spread out before him. His crew was still under the impression that they were on a mission to the Arctic. To them, the idea of the South Pole as their destination was nothing more than a distant rumor, something Jansen had kept a secret. Jansen was a man who valued control and secrecy. He had carefully planned every detail of this expedition, making sure that no one on board had the full picture of their mission. They had stopped in Greenland to acquire sled dogs, something that made sense to the crew under the belief that they were heading to the Arctic. But Jansen had a different plan. As the Kvitnes sailed toward the southern hemisphere, Jansen's thoughts were consumed by the race against the British. He had been following the progress of Captain Harris's ship from afar, and he knew that once they arrived at the Antarctic, it would be a battle to see who would reach the South Pole first. Jansen's men had no idea that they were about to embark on an entirely different journey than what they had signed up for. On board, his trusted second-in-command, Olaf Balland, approached him with a question that had been on the mind of many of the men. "Captain," Balland asked, lowering his voice, "why are we stopping in Greenland? Are we going to the North Pole or the South?" Jansen looked up, his sharp eyes locking with Balland's. "We are going south, Olaf. The Arctic isn't our destination." Balland's eyes widened in surprise. He had suspected something was amiss, but hearing it from Jansen's lips confirmed his doubts. South? To the South Pole? Jansen nodded, his expression cold but resolute. Yes, we're going to beat the British to the South Pole. I've kept it a secret for a reason. The men need to focus on the mission, not the competition. But now you know. We will be the first to plant the Norwegian flag at the South Pole. Balland nodded silently, understanding the weight of what Jansen had just revealed. The men would be in for a shock when they learned the true nature of their mission. They would be part of a race that would push them to their physical and mental limits. It was a race against Harris and the Vellora, and the stakes couldn't be higher. As the Kvitnes made its way south, Jansen called a meeting with his most trusted crew members. He gathered them in the ship's small mess hall, where the cold seemed to seep through the wooden walls, despite the fire crackling in the stove. I know some of you are questioning our destination, Jansen began, his voice calm but firm, and I want to make it clear that we are not going to the Arctic. We are heading south, to the South Pole. We will be the first to get there. We will claim the pole for Norway. The men exchanged looks, a mixture of surprise and disbelief flashing across their faces. But Jansen was a man they trusted, and they knew that if he said this was their mission, they would follow him to the ends of the earth. We've trained for the Arctic, but Antarctica is another beast entirely, Jansen continued. The conditions will be harsher, the cold more extreme, but we will make it. And when we do, we will be the first to plant the Norwegian flag at the South Pole. Balland spoke up, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. What about the British, Captain? What if they're already there? Jansen's eyes hardened. We'll be faster, Olaf. We'll have the advantage of surprise. And while they rely on their ponies and motorized sledges, we will use our dogs and our skis. We know this terrain better than they do. The crew nodded, absorbing Jansen's words. They were ready. Back on the Vellora, Captain Harris was facing his own challenges. The weather had begun to turn colder, and the ice was thickening. Harris had been warned that the conditions could change quickly, but nothing could have fully prepared them for the relentless cold of the Antarctic. Each day was a test of endurance, a battle against the elements. The ponies, though strong, were slowing them down, and the sledges seemed to sink into the thick snow with each passing mile. But Harris remained resolute. He knew they had the best equipment available, and he trusted his men. Yet, as they moved further south, the thought of Jansen's team lingered in his mind. He had to keep pushing forward, keep leading them, no matter the obstacles. He couldn't afford to let the Norwegians get a head start. The race was on, and every moment counted. It was late October when the Kvitnes finally reached the coast of Antarctica. Jansen's crew began to unload the sled dogs, preparing them for the harsh journey ahead. They had no idea how fierce the cold would be, or how quickly their plans would be tested. But for now, there was a sense of quiet determination in the air. They had crossed the point of no return, and the only way was forward. As the men prepared their sledges and food supplies, Jansen stood at the edge of the ice, staring out at the white expanse that stretched before them. It was an intimidating sight, but it was also a place where he would make his mark in history. They would beat Harris to the South Pole. He was certain of it. The secret was out now, and the race had truly begun. Chapter 4: Establishing Depots. The winds howled across the Antarctic ice as the two rival expeditions began to settle into the harsh environment. The Valora, with Captain Edmund Harris at the helm, had successfully made it onto the ice. The cold, biting their faces as they unloaded supplies and prepared for the long journey ahead. The men were tired, their bodies already feeling the relentless chill that only Antarctica could provide, but they knew that they had to keep moving forward. The first step in the race to the South Pole was not just about reaching the pole itself, it was about surviving the extreme conditions and making sure that they could return home after the expedition. That's why setting up depots of supplies was critical. Captain Harris had spent years preparing for this moment, and now, standing on the ice with his crew around him, he was ready to take that first step into the unknown. "I want us to be smart about this, men," Harris said, his voice cutting through the wind. "The journey to the South Pole will be long and grueling. We need to ensure that we have enough supplies to make it there and back, and to do that, we'll need depots scattered along the way. We'll store food, fuel, and equipment at these points, and when we're on our return journey, we'll use them to restock. It's a long road ahead, but if we plan it right, we'll have a fighting chance." Sam Weston, always eager to get moving, looked around at the ice. "Where should we start, Captain?" Harris pointed to the horizon, where the ice seemed to stretch on forever. "We'll go south, but we need to make sure that we're not too far from our base at any point. We'll head out to a designated point, set up a depot, and then return here to prepare for the next leg of the journey." The men set to work. They spent the next few days hauling sledges filled with food and equipment out into the icy wilderness. The cold was unbearable, but the men worked efficiently, knowing that every moment spent out in the open was another risk to their safety. They knew that the longer they were exposed to the elements, the greater the chance of something going wrong. The first depot was established just a few days later, about 60 kilometers from their base. It was a painstaking task, digging into the snow and creating a shelter for the food and supplies. They placed large, colorful flags at the depot to ensure they could find it again, marking it as a crucial spot on their map. This first depot was essential, but it was only the beginning. Harris knew they needed more, much more, if they were to reach the South Pole and survive the return journey. Meanwhile, Captain Thorvaldur Jansen aboard the Kvitnes was also preparing to set up his depots, but his approach was different. Unlike Harris, who had a large crew to rely on, Jansen's team was smaller and more experienced with the harsh conditions of the Arctic. His men were trained for the cold and had spent years preparing for this journey. Jansen's focus was efficiency, he had to be quick and precise. His goal was not just to reach the South Pole, but to do so before Harris, and in the most efficient way possible. As the Kvitnes made its way deeper into the Antarctic, Jansen's crew was already beginning to lay out their plans for the depots. Jansen was meticulous in his planning. He had already mapped out the locations of several depots that would be placed at regular intervals, ensuring that they had enough supplies to complete their journey and return safely. But there was something more. Jansen's plan included several smaller depots, hidden from sight and difficult to locate, allowing them to keep a strategic advantage. The British team, he knew, would have to rely on larger, more visible depots, which would make it easier for his team to stay one step ahead. Jansen's second-in-command, Olaf Balland, had concerns. He had seen the brutal cold and how quickly it could sap a man's strength. "Captain, are you sure these depots will be enough?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "The terrain is unforgiving, and we don't have the same number of men as the British. We need to be careful about how we plan." Jansen turned to him, his eyes sharp with resolve. "We'll be faster, Olaf. We'll be smarter. The British are depending on the motor sledges and ponies, but we have the dogs. We'll move faster and more efficiently. Our depots will be just enough to sustain us through the toughest parts of the journey." Despite Balland's concerns, Jansen remained confident. He knew that the key to success was not just about getting to the South Pole. It was about making sure they could outlast their rivals. Harris's reliance on ponies and mechanical sledges would slow him down, and Jansen intended to use that to his advantage. By the time the Kvitnes had reached its first depot site, a small mountain pass that led into the interior of the continent, Jansen's men had already laid the groundwork. They quickly established a small shelter, piled it with food, and placed a series of black flags marking the spot. The depot was strategically positioned to ensure that they had a safe place to restock when the time came. As with the British depot, this was only the first step. Jansen knew that they would need more, especially if they were to complete the journey before Harris. The temperature had begun to plummet as both teams made their respective moves deeper into the continent. The wind picked up, and the men found it increasingly difficult to work outside for long periods of time. But they pressed on, knowing that every step forward was another step closer to their goal. Days passed, and the two expeditions continued to set up their depots, each trying to outpace the other, each team aware that time was running out. The men worked tirelessly, hauling supplies and digging into the snow to create temporary shelters where they could leave essential provisions. Each depot was carefully positioned, marked with flags and signs to ensure that both crews would be able to find them again. It was in these days, on the frozen wasteland of Antarctica, that the true nature of the race became clear. It was not just about reaching the pole. It was about the survival of each man, the ability to outlast the other expedition, and to be the first to return home with the flag planted at the South Pole. Captain Harris knew that every depot they set up was critical, If they ran out of food or equipment, they wouldn't make it back. Every supply they left behind had to be used wisely, as there was no guarantee of finding another depot when they needed it most. And as they continued south, the challenges grew more daunting. The cold was relentless, and the ice beneath their feet became treacherous. The men could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on them. For Jansen and his crew, the story was no different. Their depots were their lifelines, strategically placed to give them the advantage over the British. They knew that their rivals would depend on their depots as much as they would on theirs. But Jansen had no intention of relying on anything but his own skills and the loyalty of his crew. The depots were more than just supply caches. They were markers in the race, signs that would guide each team forward and perhaps, in the end, determine who would emerge victorious in the race. To the South Pole, the ice, which had been silent and empty, had become a battlefield. And for now, both teams were locked in a race to secure their future. Chapter 5: Winter's Challenge. The Antarctic winter had arrived with a vengeance. The days grew shorter, and the icy winds began to sweep across the barren landscape, carrying with them the promise of months of isolation and darkness. The two rival expeditions, each with their own unique goals and preparations, had settled into their respective camps. It was now the dead of winter, and there was no escaping the oppressive cold that clung to everything: the men, their equipment, and even their thoughts. The temperature hovered at 30 degrees Celsius, but it felt even colder as the wind howled across the icy terrain, cutting through clothing like knives. For Captain Edmund Harris and his men, winter meant months of waiting, of preparing, and of enduring. They were isolated in the most desolate, hostile environment on Earth, cut off from the rest of the world. But the Valora's crew was determined to make the most of their time. Inside their base at Cape Evans, they huddled together around the warmth of small stoves, repairing equipment, planning their route to the South Pole, and training for the grueling journey ahead. The warmth of the fire offered some comfort, but it couldn't erase the mental strain of being so far from home, in a place where survival was a daily struggle. Captain Harris had made it clear from the beginning: this was no ordinary expedition. Every member of the crew had their role to play, but more than anything, he wanted them to stay focused. Their goal was the South Pole, and in order to achieve that, they would have to be strong and work together as a team. It's not just the physical journey we have to prepare for, Harris said, pacing in front of the group one evening, his breath visible in the air. The mental endurance is just as important. Every man here needs to keep their mind sharp. We will face hardships, but we must remember why we're here. We're doing this for the British Empire, and we'll make history. Sam Weston, always quick to bring a little lightness into their otherwise grim existence, spoke up. "Aye, Captain. I think we're ready. We've been training with the sledges, learned to handle the ponies, and we've even become good friends with the cold." His grin was infectious, though Harris didn't smile back. "Don't underestimate it, Sam," Harris replied. "The cold here isn't like any cold we've faced before. It's a different kind of cold, one that can freeze you in an instant. This winter will be our true test." Over the next few weeks, Harris's crew continued to prepare for the journey ahead, but the weather only grew worse. Snowstorms swept through Cape Evans, blocking visibility and making it nearly impossible to train outdoors for long periods. Harris ordered that the men spend most of their time indoors, working on their equipment, ensuring the sledges were in top shape, and organizing their supplies. They had to make sure everything was ready, as they knew that once they set off for the South Pole, there would be no turning back. Despite the hardships, the morale in the camp remained relatively high. The men maintained a daily routine, some practicing skiing indoors, others checking the ponies' food supplies. Every day felt like a battle against the elements, but every man knew that they had a role to play. Meanwhile, on the other side of the continent, Captain Thorvaldur Jansen and his Norwegian team were facing the same challenges, but their approach to winter was different. Unlike the British, who had relied on a large crew, ponies, and motorized sledges, Jansen had assembled a smaller, more experienced team, each man capable of handling the harshest conditions with minimal support. They had come prepared, with sled dogs, skis, and the strength of their wills. The Kvitnes had made it to their base camp on the Antarctic coast, and they too were now enduring the long, dark months of winter. But unlike the British, who had opted to stay relatively close to their base and continue with basic preparations, Jansen and his men were already focused on the task at hand. They used the long winter nights to fine-tune their equipment, work on their skills, and keep their bodies in peak condition. "Remember, men," Jansen said one evening, his voice steady and calm despite the howling wind outside their camp. "The winter here is not just a challenge, it's an opportunity. We have time to hone our skills, improve our equipment, and prepare for what's ahead. But we must never let our guard down. Every day counts." Olaf Balland, Jansen's second in command, listened carefully. He understood the gravity of Jansen's words. But there was also a sense of growing unease in the camp. The men had spent months preparing, and they had come to trust Jansen's leadership. However, there was something about the constant winter darkness and the isolation that began to take its toll. The men's spirits, while still strong, began to show signs of strain. "I don't know about you, Olaf," one of the men, Eric Lund, remarked one night as they gathered around the fire, "but I've never felt so far from home. The cold out there. It's not just in the air, it gets inside you. I almost feel like I'm losing my grip." Balland turned to him, his face etched with concern. "It's natural to feel this way. This place, it can break a man if he lets it. But we have a purpose. We have a goal, and we must remember that." The Norwegian crew had their own version of mental and physical training. They would go on short expeditions in the harsh conditions, skiing in the blinding snow, testing the limits of their endurance. They pushed their bodies to the limit, and in doing so, they prepared for the even greater trials that lay ahead. Jansen had been keeping a close eye on the men's progress, and it wasn't long before he began to push them harder. "We need to be ready for anything," he said one morning as the men prepared to leave for a training track. "We need to move faster than Harris, and we need to keep our equipment light. The cold will slow us down if we let it, but we're going to be faster, smarter, and stronger. We can't let them get a head start." For Jansen, this was not just about reaching the South Pole. It was about proving that Norway, with its small team and determination, could outlast the British expedition. The challenge was not only physical, but also psychological. If they could outlast the winter, outlast the cold, then they could outlast anything. Back at Cape Evans, Harris knew the same. The winter was more than just a season. It was a test of endurance. Every day, as the men worked indoors, he could feel the tension building. The harsh weather had forced them to stay inside for longer periods, and this led to frustration. But they continued their work, determined to make sure that when the time came to leave for the pole, they would be ready. As the winter months dragged on, the sense of isolation became more pronounced. The Vellora was surrounded by the ice, and the ship was locked in place. There would be no supplies from the outside world, no contact with the rest of humanity. They were truly alone. Harris and his crew were aware of the magnitude of their undertaking. Each day spent in the cold, each challenge faced, felt like a reminder that this was no ordinary journey. This was a battle for survival, and every day they spent preparing was a day closer to reaching their goal. But it was also a day closer to the unknown, to the grueling trek ahead. Harris's resolve hardened with each passing day. For Jansen's team, the challenge of winter had also begun to take its toll. They had pushed their bodies to the limit, and now it was time to move forward. There were still many unknowns, but Jansen had prepared them for this moment. His men had grown stronger, both physically and mentally, and they were ready for the journey south. The challenge of winter had shaped both teams. For Harris, it was a constant reminder of the stakes, of the uncertainty of the South Pole, of the endless challenges that lay ahead. For Jansen, it was an opportunity to sharpen his crew, to make them stronger, more resilient, and more determined to reach the pole before anyone else. Winter had done its work. The men had been tested. And now, as the days began to lengthen, it was time to move forward. The true race to the South Pole was about to begin. Chapter 6. The First Move. The darkness of the Antarctic winter was slowly beginning to recede, and with the return of the sun, both expeditions knew that the time had come. For months they had been preparing, mentally and physically, for the long journey to the South Pole. The harsh winter had tested their endurance and resilience, but now the real challenge awaited them. The race was about to begin in earnest. At Cape Evans, the Vellora's crew was ready. The depot systems were in place, supplies were stocked, and the ponies, sledges, and motorized sledges had been tested. Captain Edmund Harris stood at the front of the camp, staring out at the barren landscape of ice and snow. His crew had been anxiously awaiting this moment. The days of waiting were over, and the grueling trek to the South Pole had finally begun. Harris felt a familiar weight on his shoulders. He knew that this journey would demand everything from him and his men. It wasn't just the physical challenges they would face, but the mental strain of being so far from home, isolated in the icy wilderness. The ice stretched endlessly before them, a blank canvas on which their fates would be written. The first sledges were packed, ready to go. Sam Weston, always the optimist, couldn't contain his excitement. "We're finally moving, Captain," Weston said, giving Harris a grin as he adjusted his gear. "It's about time." Harris nodded but didn't smile. "We have a long way to go, Sam. But yes, it's time. Every step we take is another step toward history. But don't forget, we must be careful. We have to be smart." The team set off at dawn, their skis slicing through the snow and the sledges in tow, each one carefully loaded with provisions. The air was still, the only sound that of the sledges scraping across the ice. The first few hours were manageable. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the icy expanse. The temperature was bearable, and the men kept up a steady pace. But Harris knew better than to be lulled into a false sense of security. They had only just begun, and the real test would come once they were deeper into the continent, when the snow would become thicker, the winds would grow harsher, and the cold would take on an even more brutal edge. After several hours of steady travel, the men paused for a brief rest. Harris called them together, his voice low but firm. "Remember, we must make good time, but we also must conserve our strength. The journey ahead is long, and we can't afford to burn ourselves out in the first days." Sam Weston nodded, but there was a look of determination in his eyes. "Don't worry, Captain. We'll be fine. We've trained for this." Harris's gaze hardened. "Training is one thing, Sam. The real test begins now. The conditions will only get worse. We'll face snowstorms, freezing temperatures, and exhaustion. We need to stay focused and be prepared for anything." The men took a quick break, sipping from their flasks and checking their equipment. They had no idea what lay ahead, but they knew that once they set foot on this ice, they were committed. There was no turning back now. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away on the Kvitnes, Captain Thorvaldur Jansen and his crew were also preparing for their first move. The long winter months had been spent refining their strategy, and now it was time to execute it. The Norwegian crew had spent their time more efficiently than the British. Their team was smaller, but they were experienced and well-versed in the harsh conditions of the Arctic and Antarctic. Jansen had chosen his team carefully, each man capable of enduring the hardships ahead. Jansen stood at the front of his camp, staring out over the icy wilderness. The Kvitnes had been safely docked, and the sledges, dogs, and supplies were ready. His crew was nervous, but they were also eager. They had spent enough time in the camp. It was time to move. "We're ready to begin," Jansen said, his voice steady. "Remember, we're not just racing against Harris and the Valora. We're racing against time. Every moment counts. We can't afford to waste a single step." Olaf Balland, Jansen's trusted second in command, looked at the men gathered around him. "We've trained in this cold, and we've learned how to move quickly. But we also have to remember that speed can be dangerous. We need to pace ourselves." Jansen turned to Balland with a hard look. "Yes, Olaf, but we need to stay ahead. Harris is already out there. We can't afford to let him gain ground." The Norwegian team was ready. The sledges were packed, the dogs harnessed, and their equipment checked. Jansen's crew knew that. The race would not be won through brute force alone. It would be won through strategy, speed, and, above all, endurance. They had a clear advantage in terms of mobility. While Harris depended on ponies and motorized sledges, Jansen's team relied on their sled dogs and skis, allowing them to cover ground faster and more efficiently. The Kvitnes crew set out, their skis cutting through the thick snow. The dogs pulled the sledges with determination, their paws leaving deep impressions in the soft snow. The team moved steadily, maintaining a quick pace but keeping their energy in reserve for the long journey ahead. "Focus on the task at hand," Jansen reminded his crew. "Don't think about the South Pole yet. Think about the next depot. Think about the next step." But even as Jansen spoke, he was already thinking ahead. He had planned their route carefully, ensuring that they would take a path that would give them the best chance of reaching the pole first. They would lay down depots of supplies at regular intervals, and they would never stray too far from the route. The key was consistency and speed. For the next few days, both teams made steady progress. The Valora moved southward, following Harris's careful plan. The crew was in high spirits, despite the occasional blizzard that would sweep across the ice. Harris kept a tight grip on his crew, always making sure that they stayed focused. He knew that the first few days would be easy enough, but the real challenges lay ahead, once the temperature dropped even further and the snowstorms grew more intense. Sam Weston, usually the most cheerful of the crew, began to feel the strain. The conditions, though manageable at first, were starting to take their toll. The cold was wearing them down, and the snow seemed to stretch on forever. But he kept his thoughts to himself. He knew better than to complain. There was a job to be done, and no matter how difficult, they had to keep moving forward. Meanwhile, Jansen and his crew had already covered more distance than Harris's team in the same amount of time. The Norwegian team had pushed hard, but they knew they had to pace themselves. Jansen's eyes never left the horizon, always looking for signs of danger or opportunity. His strategy was working so far, but he knew that the moment they lost their advantage, Harris would be right behind them. It was on the fourth day of the journey that the first real challenge presented itself. The weather turned violent, with a snowstorm blowing in from the east, reducing visibility to near zero. Both teams were forced to take shelter, huddling together to avoid freezing in the bitter wind. The storm raged for hours, and the teams spent their time checking their equipment, making sure everything was secured. Harris's crew huddled in their tents, trying to stay warm. Harris sat alone, his mind racing. This was just the beginning, and already the weather was starting to slow them down. How long would they be able to keep this pace? How much longer could they survive in this frozen hell? In the Norwegian camp, Jansen remained calm despite the storm. He knew that this was part of the journey. They had to adapt. They had to survive. Every storm, every setback, was just another obstacle to overcome. The only thing that mattered was getting to the pole first. As the storm subsided and both teams continued their journeys, they each knew that the true race had just begun. Every decision they made, every step they took, would determine their success. The South Pole was still far off, but they were already feeling the weight of the journey. The ice would be unforgiving, and only the strongest, most determined would make it to the end. The first move had been made. The race to the South Pole was on. Chapter 7. Struggling with the terrain. The struggle had begun in earnest. The first few days of their journey south had been manageable, but as both the British and Norwegian teams ventured deeper into the Antarctic wilderness, the true nature of the terrain began to reveal itself. What had initially seemed like a vast, open expanse of snow and ice now felt more like an impenetrable, hostile world. The icy plains stretched endlessly before them, a never-ending sea of white. The further they traveled, the more the terrain grew treacherous, and the temperature continued to drop, testing their physical and mental limits. Captain Edmund Harris's face was drawn, his eyes narrowed against the stinging cold. He stood at the front of his team, his breath visible in the frigid air. The sun barely hovered above the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow-covered landscape. The sledges, loaded with supplies, creaked and groaned as they made their way through the thick snow, with the ponies pulling them slowly but steadily. Yet, even as the ponies moved forward, it was clear that their strength was being sapped by the cold and the heavy snow. The landscape, once an expansive canvas of white, now seemed to resist every step. "Captain, we need to lighten the load," Sam Weston called out from behind him, pulling his sled with obvious strain. His breath came in visible clouds, and his face was streaked with exhaustion. "The ponies are struggling, and the snow is only getting deeper. We're not making the progress we should be." Harris nodded but did not respond immediately. He knew that Weston was right. The snow was becoming increasingly difficult to move through, and the ponies' hooves seemed to sink into it with each step. The ground had become soft, and the sledges were now dragging, making every step forward feel like a battle. The snow was not just a challenge to navigate, it was a force that seemed to push them back with every mile. "We'll stop at the next depot," Harris finally said, his voice cold but determined. "Rest the ponies, check the supplies, and then we'll reassess. We can't afford to push them too hard too soon." Weston didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes tired but resolute. He knew better than anyone that pushing the ponies too far would only lead to disaster. The conditions were tough enough without adding exhaustion into the mix. As they reached the next depot, Harris called for a halt. The men dismounted, immediately starting the process of checking their supplies, taking care of the ponies, and setting up camp. The storm had been building for hours, and they knew they had to make the most of the brief respite before the next blizzard hit. The depot, a small shelter made of snow and ice, was their sanctuary for the moment. The men worked silently, their faces frozen from the wind and cold. The few moments of rest did little to ease the weariness in their bones. Harris watched them, noting how each man moved slower now, their energy depleted by the harsh terrain. It wasn't just the physical strain. It was the mental fatigue that wore on them the most. Each time they looked ahead, the snow stretched on, endless and unyielding. They had to keep going, but for how long? Meanwhile, several hundred miles to the east, Captain Thorvaldur Jansen and his Norwegian crew were facing a similar struggle. The Kvitnes had already traveled for days, their sled dogs pulling the sledges with determination. Yet, even with their superior mobility, the terrain was taking its toll on the crew. The dogs, though strong and experienced, were having difficulty maneuvering through the deep snow. The landscape had become more rugged, and the ice was not the smooth surface they had anticipated. Jagged ridges of ice formed high peaks that towered over them, creating treacherous slopes and steep drops that were impossible to navigate with sledges. Jansen's face was etched with frustration as he surveyed the landscape. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for a way forward, but the terrain seemed to mock them. The flat expanse they had once crossed so confidently was now an obstacle course of ice mounds, fissures, and snowdrifts. "Keep your skis steady," Jansen called to his men as they pushed forward. "Watch your step. We can't afford to slip now." The team had always been known for their strength and adaptability, but even they were struggling against the terrain. The snow was soft, and their skis would often sink deep into it, making every step feel like a battle. The sledges, now loaded with supplies, had begun to drag in the thick snow. The dogs, which had once pulled them easily, were now showing signs of fatigue. Some of the smaller dogs were slowing down, their paws raw from the ice and snow. "Captain," Balin said, his voice strained, "we need to adjust our route. If we keep going at this pace, we'll burn out the dogs, and we'll be stuck in the middle of nowhere." Jansen turned to face his second-in-command. "I know, Olaf, but we can't afford to change direction now. We've already lost time with the British. We need to push forward and reach the next depot before the storm hits." The wind had begun to pick up again, and the snowflakes stung as they whipped through the air. Jansen pulled his coat tighter around him and looked out at the rugged terrain ahead. There was no turning back now. The ice was their world, and they had to navigate it no matter the cost. They continued on, the dogs pulling the sledges through the deep snow, but the terrain was taking its toll on them. The dogs were panting heavily, their breath visible in the cold air, and their paws left deep impressions in the snow. Each step forward felt more like a battle against the ice, a fight to make even the smallest amount of progress. The team was growing weary, and even the most experienced of the men began to show signs of exhaustion. The constant struggle against the terrain was wearing them down, both physically and mentally. Back with the British, Harris and his crew were facing a similar challenge. The terrain had begun to grow more treacherous as well. The snow was not as smooth as they had hoped, and the sledges had begun to sink into the snow, dragging them down. The ponies were growing tired, their hooves now struggling to make any progress in the deep snow. The weight of their equipment was slowing them down, and the cold only added to the strain. Harris had kept a steady pace, but he could see the men's weariness in their eyes. The journey was taking longer than expected. "Captain," said one of the men, his voice hoarse, "the ponies, they can't pull much longer. We need to reconsider our route." Harris turned to look at the man, his expression grave. He knew the ponies were struggling, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The longer they delayed, the greater the risk of losing ground to the Norwegians. "I know," Harris said quietly. "But we need to keep moving. We can't stop now." The men did not argue. They were all too aware of the stakes. The race was not just about reaching the South Pole, it was about survival. The terrain was challenging, and every step forward was a victory. But it was also a reminder of how harsh and unforgiving the Antarctic environment could be. As the days passed, both teams continued to face the challenges of the treacherous terrain. The ice was unyielding, the snow thick and deep. But every step they took brought them closer to their goal, closer to the South Pole. They were locked in a race against each other, but more importantly, they were locked in a race against the land itself. The terrain was the true enemy now, and the struggle to move forward had become the defining battle of the journey. Chapter 8. Reaching the Plateau. The journey to the South Pole had been long, grueling, and filled with challenges. But now, the moment they had been pushing toward for months had finally arrived. The terrain had grown more treacherous, the snow deeper, and the cold harsher. Yet despite the exhaustion that clung to their bones, both the British and Norwegian teams had managed to push forward. And now, after what felt like an eternity, they had reached a critical point in their expedition, the Bia Plateau. For Captain Edmund Harris and his men, the plateau represented a turning point. They had crossed vast stretches of ice and snow, passed through grueling storms, and endured the biting cold. But the plateau stood as a barrier between them and the South Pole. It was a high, flat expanse of ice that would give them a clear view of their destination, but it was also a place where their stamina, resources, and resolve would be tested even further. The winds here were unpredictable, and the terrain was relentless, forcing the men to rethink their strategy. The British team had arrived at the edge of the plateau after days of exhausting travel, and as they stepped onto the vast open expanse of ice, the reality of their situation began to settle in. Harris stood at the front of the group, his eyes scanning the icy horizon, trying to make sense of what lay ahead. The cold wind cut through his clothes, stinging his skin, but it was the weight of the journey that truly bore down on him. "We're here," Harris muttered, almost to himself, as he surveyed the seemingly endless stretch of ice before them. It was a moment of triumph, yet, at the same time, it felt like they were only just beginning the hardest part of their journey. Sam Weston, ever the optimist, walked up to Harris, his face tired but filled with determination. "We've made it, Captain. We're standing on the plateau. The South Pole is just ahead." Harris nodded but didn't speak for a moment. He was used to Weston's infectious optimism, but this was a different kind of journey. The plateau was no place for celebrations. This was a place where even the smallest misstep could be deadly. The distance between them and the South Pole was still a formidable challenge, and Harris knew they couldn't afford to lose focus now. "We've made it this far," Harris said, his voice steady but filled with the gravity of the situation. "But this is just the beginning. The South Pole is still a long way off, and we've got a long road ahead." Weston glanced over at him, catching the seriousness in Harris's tone. "We'll make it, Captain. We've faced worse, and we're together in this." The men began unloading their sledges, taking care to preserve what little strength they had left. They had reached the plateau, but they were still in the thick of it. The snow beneath them was hard-packed and slippery, and every step they took felt like an effort against the frozen earth. Even the ponies, who had been their faithful companions since the beginning of the journey, seemed to struggle against the harsh conditions of the plateau. For the next few days, Harris and his crew made slow but steady progress. They were still fighting the elements, but the plateau at least provided a relatively flat surface to move across, even if it was relentlessly cold. The men were exhausted, but they knew that they couldn't stop. Every day spent on the plateau was a day closer to the South Pole, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. Meanwhile, miles to the east, Captain Thorvaldur Jansen and his Norwegian team were facing their own set of challenges as they approached the plateau. The Kvitnes had been moving steadily, the dogs pulling the sledges with determination, their paws leaving deep impressions in the snow. Yet even the Norwegian team, which had relied on their skis and dogs rather than ponies and motor sledges, was starting to feel the strain. The plateau, too, represented a turning point for Jansen's men. The air was thin at this altitude, and the winds were fierce, battering them from all directions. The ice stretched out in every direction, seemingly without end. Jansen knew that they had to push on, but he could see the fatigue in his men's eyes. "How much further, Captain?" Olaf Balland asked, his voice hoarse from the cold, his breath visible in the frigid air. Jansen looked out across the plateau, his expression unreadable. "We're close," he said. But this is where the real challenge begins. The winds here are fierce, and we'll need to keep our wits about us. The dogs are strong, but they're tired. We can't afford to push them too hard. Balland nodded, though he couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. They had been traveling for weeks, and the harsh conditions were starting to take their toll. The dogs, while still eager, were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. Jansen had carefully rationed their supplies, but even he knew that the plateau would be the ultimate test of their endurance. Jansen gathered his crew together, his voice firm but encouraging. "We've made it this far, men. We've crossed the ice and faced the storms. The South Pole is within reach, but we have to remain sharp. Every step we take on this plateau brings us closer to our goal. Stay focused. We can't afford to let our guard down." The men gathered their sledges and continued on, their skis cutting through the icy terrain, their minds focused on the goal ahead. The cold was biting, and the winds howled around them, but they pushed forward. The plateau was unforgiving, but it was also a place where every team could measure their progress. It was the final stretch before the real challenges would begin, the final push toward the South Pole. Both teams, the British and the Norwegian, were now on the plateau, each facing the same icy landscape, the same harsh conditions. For Harris and his men, the plateau represented the culmination of months of work, but it was also a reminder that the race was far from over. The South Pole was still a long way off, and the terrain would only get more difficult. For Jansen and his crew, the plateau was both a victory and a challenge. They had reached the same point as their rivals, but they knew that the British were close behind. The next few days passed slowly, the men struggling to maintain their pace. The plateau had no mercy. It was a harsh, unforgiving land, and each step took more effort than the last. The sledges seemed to sink deeper into the snow with each passing hour, and the wind howled louder as the days wore on. But despite the exhaustion, despite the cold, both teams continued to move forward. And then, one fateful morning, as the sun began to rise over the snow-covered horizon, both teams found themselves standing at the edge of the plateau. Ahead lay the final stretch to the South Pole, the final battle for glory. They had reached the plateau, but now the true test began. The journey was far from over, and the race to the South Pole had entered its most critical phase. Chapter 9. The Final Push. The time had come. After months of endless travel through unforgiving ice fields, through blizzards, through the biting cold of the Antarctic wilderness, the final push toward the South Pole had begun. For both Captain Edmund Harris and Captain Thorvaldur Jansen, it was a moment of triumph and trepidation. They had come so far, endured so much, and yet the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. Both teams knew that they were nearing their goal, but they also knew that the road to the South Pole was a treacherous one. This would be the final test, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The British team, Captain Harris stood at the edge of the plateau, staring out into the distance. The wind was colder now, cutting through the layers of his clothing, and the snow stretched out endlessly ahead of him. He had always known that this final stretch would be the hardest part, but now, looking out over the barren landscape, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread. There was still so much to do, so much to overcome. Behind him, his men were preparing their sledges, the ponies exhausted and reluctant to move. The sledges themselves were weighed down with supplies. That seemed to get heavier with every passing mile. Despite all their efforts to lighten the load, the journey had taken a toll on both the animals and the men. Sam Weston walked up beside Harris, his face drawn and tired but filled with the same determination that had driven him from the start. "We're almost there, Captain," Weston said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "We've come too far to turn back now." Harris nodded, though his eyes betrayed the concern he was feeling. "I know, Sam, but we can't afford to be complacent. We've pushed through a lot to get here, but the last miles are always the hardest. The cold is relentless. The wind is brutal, and we've already lost so much strength." Weston paused, looking out at the vast expanse of ice ahead of them. "We've trained for this," he said finally, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We've faced worse before. We can do this." Harris wasn't so sure. The reality of the situation had settled in. The further they traveled, the more isolated they felt. The snowstorms had become more frequent, the winds sharper, and each step forward felt heavier than the last. But he couldn't let his crew see his doubts. They were relying on him to lead them to victory. The Valora's crew set off, again their sledges slowly moving forward. Harris knew they couldn't afford to stop. The longer they rested, the harder it would be to get back on track. Every minute counted. As they trudged across the ice, the men's movements became slower, their exhaustion starting to show. The ponies, too, were struggling, their hooves sinking deeper into the snow with each step. Hours passed, the landscape unchanged, the wind howling and relentless. Every day felt the same as they continued the slog through the freezing cold, trying to keep their pace. But they were fading, their strength waning. Harris had been watching his men, counting the hours, keeping track of the distance. They had to make it, but the further they went, the more difficult it became to keep up morale. As the day began to close, the team made camp once more. The temperature dropped even further as the men worked to set up their shelter. The exhaustion was overwhelming. As Harris and Weston worked together to build a small tent for the night, Harris felt the weight of his leadership pressing down on him. He knew his men were at their breaking point, and the South Pole was still so far away. He had pushed them hard, but now he wasn't sure if they had the strength to finish the journey. "How much further, Captain?" Weston asked, looking over at Harris with concern. "Do we have enough to make it?" Harris took a deep breath, forcing the weight of his doubts down. "We've got enough for one last push," he said. "We make it to the South Pole, and then we come back." The Norwegian team, Captain Jansen and his crew had made similar progress. Though smaller in number, the Kvitnes team was far from inexperienced, and their knowledge of the icy terrain had given them an advantage. They had moved faster than the British, but the final stretch was still just as challenging. Their sled dogs had been pulling relentlessly, their fur matted with snow, and their paws aching from the cold. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal, but it also brought them closer to exhaustion. Jansen's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the expanse of ice before them. The wind whipped around them, stinging their skin, and the ground beneath their skis was uneven, shifting with each step. It was harder now than it had been before. They had passed through the easy stretches, and now they were on the final, most dangerous part of the journey. The dogs were exhausted, the sledges weighed down with supplies that grew heavier with every mile. Olaf Balland walked up beside Jansen, his face pale from the cold. "We can't keep going at this pace, Captain. The dogs are struggling, and the snow is deepening. We need to rest." Jansen didn't look at him, his gaze focused on the path ahead. "We can't stop now, Olaf. Not when we're this close. We've sacrificed too much. The British are behind us, but we can't afford to lose our lead. Every step we take brings us closer to our goal." Balland hesitated, but knew better than to argue. Jansen had led them this far, and they had all put their trust in him. They continued on, moving forward at a slow but steady pace. The wind grew fiercer, and the snow seemed to become deeper, dragging their sledges down into the ice. But they pressed on, the dogs pulling as best as they could. Each day the men grew weaker, their energy sapped by the relentless cold and the strain of the journey. Yet, despite the exhaustion, Jansen never once faltered. He kept pushing them forward, his mind focused on the goal. He would be the first to plant the Norwegian flag at the South Pole. He had come too far to let anything stand in his way. As they neared the final stretch, Jansen called his crew together. The dogs were exhausted, their bodies weak from pulling the sledges across the ice, but they had made it this far. The South Pole was within reach. "We've come this far, men," Jansen said, his voice steady despite the toll the journey had taken on him. "This is the final push. We've faced storms, we've faced the cold, and now we face the last test. The South Pole is just ahead. We will be the first to get there. Keep your eyes on the prize." The men nodded, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and determination. They knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. They had come so far, endured so much, and now they could see the light at the end of the tunnel. With renewed resolve, they pressed on, their steps slow but determined. Takjur cold was unbearable, the wind biting, but they kept going. For Jansen and his crew there was no turning back. The South Pole was within reach, and there was only one thing left to do: finish the race. The final moment. On the 14th of December, after what felt like an eternity of struggle and sacrifice, Jansen and his team reached the South Pole. they stood at the southernmost point of the earth, the wind howling around them, the ice beneath their feet. It was a moment of triumph, of hard-earned victory, but it was also a moment of exhaustion. They had done it. They were the first to reach the South Pole. Jansen stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving with exertion. He was the first man to ever stand at the South Pole, and though it felt like an unimaginable victory, he knew that this moment was just the beginning. They had planted the Norwegian flag, but the journey back would be even harder. The cold, the exhaustion, and the brutal conditions had taken their toll on both teams, but only one had reached the pole first. Jansen smiled to himself, knowing that the world would remember this moment forever. They had won the race, but the true test would be making it back. And as he stood there, alone at the South Pole, Jansen realized something else. The race was not over. The hardest part had just begun. Chapter 10. The End of the Race. The South Pole stood silent and still, a frozen monument to human ambition and perseverance. Both Captain Edmund Harris and Captain Thorvaldur Jansen had made it this far, but the cost of the journey had been steep, and the ultimate prize of reaching the pole had come with a heavy toll. Now, the time had come to reckon with the aftermath of the race, to confront the choices they had made and the price they had paid. The British team. Harris and his men had arrived at the South Pole, their bodies fatigued, their spirits exhausted, but their pride and determination had carried them to this moment. The struggle to get there had been immense, but standing on the ice at the southernmost point of the earth, they could feel the weight of history upon them. But the triumph was short-lived. The moment they had worked for so long to achieve was marked not by joy, but by a sobering reality. Harris stood next to his men, staring at the flag that had been planted at the South Pole, the British colors flapping weakly in the cold Antarctic wind. His chest heaved, each breath a struggle against the thin, frigid air. He had done it. He had reached the pole, but his triumph felt bittersweet. "There it is," Sam Weston said, his voice strained with exhaustion. "We made it, Captain. We're the first to plant the British flag." Harris barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the pole, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The race had cost them more than he had anticipated. Their supplies were running low, their strength waning. The ponies, once strong and reliable, had barely managed to pull the sledges across the final stretch. The men, too, had been pushed to their limits. Their skin was cracked and frostbitten, their bodies weighed down by hunger and fatigue. The South Pole was now behind them, but the return journey was ahead, and it promised to be just as perilous. "This isn't the end?" Harris said quietly, turning toward his men. His voice was low but filled with determination. "We're not done. We've got to go back. We still have to get home." The words hit the men like a cold wave. They had made it to the South Pole, but the danger was far from over. Harris could see the weariness in their faces. the deep exhaustion that weighed on their shoulders. Yet there was no time for rest, no time to celebrate their victory. The return journey would be long, and they couldn't afford to waste a single moment. Sam. Weston nodded, though his expression was grim. "We'll make it, Captain. We've come this far." But even as Weston spoke, the doubt lingered in Harris's mind. The return journey was even more dangerous than the journey to the pole. They would have to navigate the same harsh terrain, battle the same relentless winds, and struggle against the icy cold. They had already lost valuable time, and they were running low on supplies. The men had no choice but to start heading back, despite the toll the journey had taken on them. The cold seemed to press in on them as they began packing up their camp. They had spent so many days preparing for this moment, but now that they had reached their goal, it felt as if the weight of the world had fallen on their shoulders. The South Pole was the destination, but now the race was about survival, getting back home alive. Harris led his team back toward their base, each step forward feeling like a battle against the elements. The ponies, still pulling their sledges, struggled against the snow. Harris knew that they would need every ounce of energy they had left to make it back to Cape Evans, but the distance was vast, and the dangers were many. The Norwegian team. Meanwhile, Captain Jansen and his Norwegian crew had arrived at the South Pole as well. The struggle to get there had been long and exhausting, but they had made it. They were the first to plant the Norwegian flag, and they stood there, gazing at the vast empty expanse of ice that stretched out before them. They had reached the pole, and though there was pride in that moment, it was also overshadowed by the realization of the hardships that lay ahead. Jansen's crew was also weary, their bodies broken by the journey. They had relied on their dogs to pull the sledges, but even the strongest dogs were showing signs of exhaustion. The sledges were heavy with supplies, and Jansen could see the weariness in the eyes of his men. They had made it to the South Pole, but they too knew that the real test was still ahead. "First to the South Pole," Jansen said, his voice carrying across the icy landscape. "We've done it, but the hardest part is still ahead. We need to go back, and we need to make it out alive." Olaf Balland, Jansen's second-in-command, stood beside him, his face tight with fatigue. "We've made it this far, Captain. But the dogs, they're exhausted. The sledges are heavy. The return journey is going to be brutal." Jansen looked over at Balland, his expression hard. "We've come too far to turn back now. The British are behind us. We can't afford to let them catch up. The South Pole is ours, and we will get back to Framheim first." Balland hesitated but said nothing. He knew the cost of this journey, and he knew that the return would be just as dangerous as the trek south. There was no time to rest. The men gathered their things, and the sledges were loaded once again. The dogs were tired, their bodies thin and worn from the journey, but Jansen didn't hesitate. They would have to push forward, no matter what. The men began the long trek back, the sledges creaking under the weight of their supplies. the dogs pulling through the deep snow. The wind howled around them, cutting through their clothes and making every step harder than the last. They had reached the South Pole first, but now the true challenge had begun. The return journey. The journey back for both teams was an unrelenting battle against the elements. Harris and Jansen pushed their men, knowing that they had to make it. Back before their supplies ran out, before the cold claimed them. The ponies had already grown weaker, their hooves raw and cracked from the harsh conditions. The sled dogs, too, had grown tired, their energy depleted by the relentless snow and ice. The snowstorms returned with a vengeance, the winds howling and stinging their skin. Both teams struggled to make progress, their sledges sinking into the deep snow, the cold numbing their fingers and faces. Every day felt like a fight against nature itself. The South Pole had been conquered, but the land had not forgiven them for daring to reach it. For Harris's team, the journey back grew more and more difficult with each passing day. Their food supplies were dwindling, and the men were beginning to suffer from exhaustion. Some of the ponies had already died, their bodies left behind in the snow as they were unable to continue. The snowstorms seemed to be never-ending, and the landscape, though once a path forward, now felt like a vast, endless void. Jansen's crew faced similar hardships. The dogs, once strong and eager, had begun to show signs of fatigue. The sledges were dragging, their supplies running low, and every inch of progress felt like an accomplishment. The men were tired, their bodies frail from the journey, but they pushed on. As the days wore on, both teams fought for survival. The cold gnawed at their bones, and the endless snow seemed to stretch out before them, mocking them with its vast emptiness. They were no longer racing for glory. They were racing against the land, the elements, and their own bodies. For both Harris and Jansen, the realization began to set in. The South Pole was an accomplishment, but the true victory was in making it back alive. The land had taken its toll, and every step forward felt like a monumental effort. There would be no celebrations, no triumphs, only the struggle to survive. And as they moved forward, each man knew that only one thing mattered now: getting home. The race was over. The goal had been reached. But the return journey would prove to be the true test. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.